Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
This is your host, Alicia Dibrell from Insight Media. Today, I get to interview CHRISTINA Macro. CHRISTINA helps move up or downsizing clients who need to sell a home and buy a home in the same transaction. She helps them to develop sound strategies based on market conditions and likely scenarios based on current trends to get their home under contract while identifying their next home. This is all done without overlap or gaps in the transition. This allows for a stress-free transaction, providing proactive consultation focused on client and overall timing. So without further ado, I want to welcome CHRISTINA Macro to the show. Hi, CHRISTINA. Welcome to the show.
Hello. How are you?
Oh, things are good over here. I just want to thank you for your time today to take, because I know that's a busy transaction when you're trying to buy or sell a home and buy a home at the same time. So this will be fun.
It sure will, and I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So tell us a little bit about yourself and where you come from.
Well, I actually am from Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I was born and raised there, and after deciding I wanted to do more with my life than live on Cape Cod at the beach, I moved to Syracuse. I went to Syracuse to spend some time with my dad, and then I ended up in the hotel industry for many, many years. And the hotel industry transferred me to the D.C. area, which is where I live now, and I've been here since 1996. And my background is hotel and restaurants. I started in the hotel industry as a waitress, and 10 years later, I was a regional vice president of sales and marketing in this market in D.C., kind of hit the glass ceiling, and then I went on to get my network engineering certification and went to work for an internet company, started there as a marketing manager and worked my way up that corporate ladder and was part of the dot-com bust. So I was without a job. And then decided that I would get my real estate license, and here I am 16 years later, still loving this industry that I'm in.
So is there anything that kind of drawed you to becoming a real estate professional, or was it just kind of a chance thing? Or?
Well, I was without a job, right? And so a friend of mine said, you should get your real estate license. And I said, I'm not really sure that that's what I want to do. I was always a corporate executive, marketing, sales, salaried positions, traveling around the world. And so I wasn't sure I wanted to take that risk. But as I thought more and more about it and my own experience of buying a home, I thought, you know what? I think I would like to do this. And I guess what it came down to for me was my why statement. I've always had a why statement. Why do I do the things that I do? And my why was I never minded working hard, but I was tired of doing it for somebody else's benefit. And so for me, for real estate, it was I knew the harder I worked, the luckier I would get, and all of the rewards would be mine, right? So working in a corporate environment, you can work very, very hard, but the rewards are the same, right? You never get a higher financial benefit, whether you work really, really hard or not really hard. So I just felt like I've always been a hard worker, and I knew that I would get 100% of the rewards from the work that I put into it. And so my first year I sold $10 million, and I never looked back. I said, okay, this is what I want to do. It was exactly why I did it. I was working hard. I was, learning and really just focused on helping people and protecting their best interest. And because of that, I built my business 100% on referrals. And it was all about that same core fundamental of never mind working hard, but I just was tired of doing it for somebody else's benefit. So it was a perfect fit for me.
I was just going to say the shoe fit. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you're right. I did kind of fall into it, but I also just took the ball and ran with it.
It seemed to work out just fine.
Exactly.
So tell me a little bit about who you help and how you help them.
Well, I built my real estate practice on focusing on referral business. So referral business can be anybody, right? It can be somebody. I'm in the DC, Maryland, Virginia. I have a broker's license in all three jurisdictions. So I help people that want to work with me, right? First and foremost. My specialty, though, is clients who are in two transactions at once. So they need to sell a house in order to buy a house, and either they're upsizing or they're downsizing, right? And the reason that I specialize in that is it requires a lot of systems, process, You need to be very strategic and very methodical. And that client I work really well with because those are skills that are very natural for me. I'm very naturally methodical. I'm very naturally strategic, and I'm very naturally, good at orchestrating and, big sort of projects and breaking them down and scaling them in a way that, there's no hiccups and there's no stress. So that's my specialty, but I do work almost exclusively by referral.
Okay. What are some things to consider before deciding to sell your property?
Well, number one, your reason. Why are you selling? That is just the most important piece of the puzzle. That, why you are selling really is the fundamental behind everything else that comes into play. So, number one, why are you selling? Number two, what's your timing? So, first, if we understand why you're selling the house, it could take us in 18 different directions in terms of strategy, right? So, for example, if you're selling the house because you're moving to California, that's a whole different process and strategy than someone who's selling the house because they can't afford the payments anymore, right? Because where you're going plays into why you're selling, and where you're going plays into how we go about getting it sold. So number one, why. Number two, your timing. And then, obviously the regular factors, the market conditions, what is your property condition, and the financial considerations, right? So what is the market like? Is the market going to be kind to you? Is there a price that you need to get versus the price that the market's going to bear? And so, understanding the market conditions and where you sit in the market. They're in your property condition. I mean, if your property is in great condition, you're taking great care of it, and it needs absolutely no work, that's a different conversation than someone who, maybe didn't take good care of their property, or maybe that there's some challenges or issues with the property. And so now you have to talk about the costs involved. And then the financial considerations, right? What does your net look like? I mean, if you're pricing your property and you really need to be able to get some proceeds to buy something new, does it fit within what you need to do and where you need to go? And all of that starts with why. Why are you selling the house? So when I sit with sellers and talk about, selling their property, we probably have a 20 to 45 minute, sometimes a couple of hours conversation about why they're selling and sort of all the legs that go with that and how it will look based on what their ideal outcome is. So it's really important. It's really important.
So does a homeowner really need a real estate agent? Because can't they just do maybe a for sale by owner or maybe listed on Craigslist or something like that?
Well, sure. A homeowner could go that route if they chose to. A seller can sell their home on their own without a real estate agent. The question really becomes, are they going to get the most money for it? Right. And are they going to sell it within the period of time that a house in their neighborhood or in their condition with their features would sell? Right. So what most sellers do is who think that they can sell their house on their own. And again, I'm not saying that it can't happen, but I'm just saying that as a general rule of thumb, the seller might get a postcard from an agent who's we just sold your neighbor's house for $250,000 and it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 2,000 square foot home. Or they might look on Zillow and try to get his estimate for the home, or they might, like you said, post it on Craigslist and see what kind of buyer they might get. But what most sellers don't realize is when you're pricing a home, the 4-bedroom, 2-bath, 2,000 square feet has a garage, and in a certain neighborhood, your price can be impacted by so many factors, right? And so most sellers, not all, but most sellers are emotionally attached to their home. So if you get a postcard that says, I've got a, 3-bedroom, 2-bath with a garage, and my neighbor sold his house for $250, but as a seller, maybe I put in a nice deck or I put in a granite countertop, most sellers are going to overvalue those things and say, well, my neighbor was $250 and that place wasn't nearly as nice as my house, so I should be able to get $300. It's very arbitrary, right? So if you look at some of the ways that a seller might price their home based on just these basic sort of fundamental features of the house without considering things like days on market, you've got to consider month supply. You've got to consider the ratio of list to sell price ratio in your neighborhood. You've got to look at absorption. You've got to look at positioning. and general inventory, right? What is the condition of the general inventory in that marketplace? And pricing, right? So you look at your price brackets and where they are. So when an agent prices a home, we don't do that. We don't just go to Zillow and say, hey, Zillow says it's worth, $250, so that's what we should price it at. And I should say a good agent, right? A good agent will sit with the seller, go through all of the features of your house, do a walkthrough, look at your yard, take into consideration the tax value and all of the statistics that I just talked about, and pull all this data together to come up with a very close range or niche. And what an agent's trying to do, or at least what I'm trying to do, is get the property priced within I want to say $1,000 of where it's going to appraise, right? Because the appraised value becomes more important than anything else. So a seller, sure, they can do that. I just don't know that they would have much success at getting the most money in the least amount of time when the homework is not done to really position that property where it needs to be positioned compared to what else is on the market and where the appraised value is going to fall. Because, that's a strategic part of it too, right? Because let's say a property is worth, and I do a CMA and I say, okay, the property is going to appraise at, $250. And I will tell you, in 16 years, I've been doing this 16 years, I've never been off on an appraisal by more than $1,000 ever, not once. So if I look at that and I tell a seller your property is worth $250, and again, I don't want this to ever not be the case, but it's always been the case that I've been within $1,000. So now if we look at that appraised value, and then we start to factor in market conditions. So if we feel like it's going to appraise at $250, now we look at what's the list price to sell price ratio. Let's say that's 98%. Now we've got a 2% play. Then we look at month supply. And let's say the month supply is only 2 months. Well, now we've got another adjustment. And let's say we've got, a very low absorption number. Now we've got to adjust accordingly. So this appraised number is kind of where it starts, and then we build the list price based on the other market conditions, mostly positioning, right, and inventory. And then we come up with a strategy to make sure that we get that property sold for that appraised value or more, right? And the other part of it too is, so you've got the market condition, the pricing, and how you really look at that. And then the other piece of it too is, how do we give your property the best space, right? So we've got to make sure that in that price range, your property is the best looking for the properties available to that same consumer, right? So that consumer is looking in a price bracket of maybe $200 to $250. We need to be the best thing in that price range if we're going to get the top end of it. So yes, can a seller just throw their property out there, throw it on Craigslist, or go to Zestimate and Zillows and sell it? They probably could. Are they going to get the most money for the least hassle and the least stress? Probably not. Probably not. And, one of the things that I always say to sellers and the sellers that I work with, when we look at the home selling process, and I know we're going to talk about that, but when we look at the home selling process, right, from the decision to sell to selecting an agent to putting the property on the market. So that piece of it is a lot of sort of strategic thinking and, strategy, right? Then the property goes on the market. And I will tell you, in the entire process, finding the buyer is the easy part. And I'm not saying that it's always easy to find the buyer, but in the process, finding the buyer is the easy part. So the seller can post it on Craigslist. You're going to find a buyer pretty easily, right? For the most part. But are you going to have a good appraisal? Are you going to have a smooth process? Are you going to have a good lender? Are you going to have a good title company? Are you going to remove contingencies and negotiate them properly? So yes, you need an agent. You need an agent for getting it there. Then once we find the buyer, we find the right buyer. And then we have a whole, another 4 to 6 weeks of daily looking at the file, talking, communicating to get to settlement so that the seller feels like it wasn't a hassle. And I will tell you, one of the things that I say to my sellers all the time is this. My goal is when we go to settlement and you see that broker fee on the HUD-1, well, now it's called a CD, but when you see that broker fee, first of all, know that I don't get all of that. But I want you to look at that number and think to yourself, Christina, you earned every penny of that. Because pricing, finding, process, settling, there's a whole bunch of different moving parts to all this. And you really need somebody good to start with that why and then get it priced properly and then move you through the process without feeling like you were beat up. So my long answer is sure, they can do that. My short answer is probably not smart.
That brings me right to my next question. What is the role of a real estate agent? I mean, you went kind of through a lot of things that you guys do, but what's the role?
For me, it's to protect the client, right? So make sure that I am keeping their best interest in mind at all times, right? So my dialogue with sellers as we go through a process, or a client, buyer too, my dialogue always is, when we get to a place where a decision needs to be made, is this. Listen, here's the decision. You can say yes, or you can say no, or you can do A, or you can do B. And if you do A or do B, or you decide one or two, whatever decision you made, here's the likely outcome to those decisions. How do you want to move forward? And so having that kind of open dialogue with clients, for me, helps the client understand that these are their decisions. I'm not here to, quote, sell a house, right? I'm here to help you, as my client, make the best decisions that are going to cost you the least amount of money and that are going to cause you the least amount of stress. My job is not to force you down a path, right? So my role is to bring you through a process in a way that you are always in control, that you are always making the best decision based on the advice and the information that I give you, and that you always feel like I am protecting you and your best interest. Ultimately, that leads to a smooth and a stress-free transaction. I have never had a stressful transaction. Never. Not once. And it's because I know when we get to a crossroad during the process of buying or selling, because I know that whatever decision you're making, I know what the outcome is likely going to be, right? Because I've been doing this so long. So it's really to make sure that my client feels like they are in control. It's their house and it's their decision, and that they at any time have the ability to say, I don't want to do this anymore, until they can no longer say, I don't want to do this anymore. And so just knowing what the process is right up front and really working through that and making sure we're all clear on how I'm going to handle their transaction, there's never an issue for me. There's just never an issue. So, and I hear so many times, that, and it's not everybody, right? But I hear many clients or friends who've said, God, I had this transaction and it was so difficult, and here's what happened. And for a number of reasons, it's not always the agent's fault, but if we can, as the agent, make sure that the client understands what the process is going to be like, we never run into those problems. It's managing expectations, really. So for me, that's what I do, and that's what my role is at a very high level, orchestrating, many, many parties involved in this transaction, and communicate and over-communicate and explain and talk and discuss at every point so that there's never any stress.
And what are the costs involved with selling a home? Because I would assume that, either your services aren't free and there's other costs involved. What would they be?
So, the cost from the start. So do you have to make any updates? Do you have to do any repairs? That's number one, right? We talked about why, market condition, property condition, financial considerations. But, number one is, do you have to make any updates? Do you have to paint walls? Do you have to, get some storage for some of your things? And then once you get past the updates and the repair piece of it, and you get into staging and, all of the things that go into moving furniture around and giving it its best space, then there's broker fees, there's other settlement costs, there's attorney's fees. For a seller, you're talking about, if there's an HOA, if there's condo, you've got to get documents, you've got to order warranties. A lot of what the seller does is time consuming and costs involved. And for the seller, the bulk of the cost for settling is the broker fee. Now, on the buy side, right, the costs are more around the lender fees, their down payment, if they are, having to travel to come see the house, if they need to go look at houses, it's mostly time. But the bulk of the cost for the buy side is the lender and the closing costs.
So can you clear up, a few myths or misconceptions about selling a home?
Number one, that it's easy, right? It's not easy to sell a home. I make it look easy, right? Because I do this full time for a living, and I'm doing it for 16 years. And so many sellers say that, and buyers say that to me. We get to settlement, and they go, "Gosh, that was so easy." I'm like, "Yeah, well, I make it look that way, right?" So number one, it's not easy. There are, let's see, you have a buyer, a seller, an agent for the buyer, an agent for the seller. You have an appraiser, a home inspector, lender, title company, and then you might have a termite guy. You might have a condo and an association. You can sometimes have up to 12 to 15 parties involved in a single transaction, right? And I think that most clients and consumers don't realize how many people and how many moving parts there are to getting and having a smooth transaction. So myth number one is, oh, it's easy. I can just go on Zillow and look online and find a house myself. I don't need an agent. Why do I need an agent? I can find it online and just go to an open house, and then I'll just go get an attorney and they'll write the contract for me, right? That's a huge misconception. There's so much more to it than just throwing a document together and putting it in front of the seller, right? Who's going to negotiate for you? How are you going to price it? What about timing, right? So this whole idea that because there's so much information out there that it's easy and why do I really need a realtor is a huge one. That's a huge one. Same for the seller, like we just talked about. For a sell by owner, just throw it on Zillow and make me move, and a buyer will come forward. And what do I need an agent for? And unless you do this for a living, you have no idea what the journey is, right? You have no idea what the steps are to get there. I certainly wouldn't expect, an attorney myself to be able to behave as an attorney for somebody. I have no idea how to be an attorney. That's not what I do. It's not my expertise. And so I think that because of this misconception that there's so much information out there that really you don't need an agent for what you used to really need an agent for. But actually now more than ever, you need an agent now more than ever, because all of that data out there is not always accurate, and you're not always getting the right information, and you're not always getting the most up-to-date information, right? So number one right there. I think the other misconception is that, buying or selling a home is something that you have to do in your life, right? And I will say that there are clients that I'll sit with, buyers and sellers, and talk through, their why and their financial situation, the market conditions. And many times I've sat with a seller or buyer and said, look, I just don't think it's right for you to buy or sell right now. And I've helped buyers get into a rental because the timing just wasn't good. And I've helped sellers stay in the home for a longer period of time and help them work in the background slowly to make the repairs or the improvements they needed to make so that they could sell it and get the most money for it, or at least procure the best buyer for it. So the other misconception is that sometimes your motivation for selling or why you're selling doesn't make sense with the current conditions or the market or what you've got going on. So I think you have to get real with that why statement and how it fits in with what the market's doing. And sometimes it's a hard conversation to have, right? Listen, Mr. Seller, and this happens more often than not. I've sat with sellers who have said, well, I'd like to get X dollars, and here's where I need to be at. And I've had to say to a seller, I'm sorry, I just can't get you that price. And the reason I can't get you that price is because the market says so. And I've had a seller who was a previous client of mine who wanted a lot more money for his house. And I did a CMA, and I told you, I've never been wrong on an appraisal in 16 years, right? So I did a CMA, sat with him and said, look, here's what I can get you. I think you're looking at about $835,000. And he said, well, with everything we did to the house and all the improvements, we really want to get 1.1. And I said, I'm sorry, you can't. I can't. Maybe there's somebody else out there that can do it. Let me know. So he didn't hire me, and he hired someone else. And I kept track of his property. He listed at 1.1, went through 4 real estate agents, and guess what it settled for? $835. So it's a really hard conversation to have, but I think that's a misconception that because you want what you want for the house means you should be able to get it through marketing, or, well, you should be able to market it more, or you should be able to find the buyer. Well, unfortunately, the market dictates. And a buyer knows the value of your house. They're out there, they're looking. So really getting real with whether it's time to sell or buy or not is a misconception that most people have. Well, just hire an agent will get it sold. Well, not always. You've got to be willing to do and work within the structure of the marketplace.
And being realistic.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard. It's a lot of money though, right? If you want to list your house for 1.1 and I'm telling you 830, that's a hard conversation to have, right? I mean, do you want to hear that? That's $300,000. But you know what? He went through a lot of pain, 4 agents, and think about that too. So he was on the market for almost a year. I could have put his house on the market, sold it for $835, and he would have moved on with his life 12 months sooner. He paid the mortgage for 12 months. He paid the taxes for 12 months. He lost that and more by just not being real. And that, again, that misconception that somebody went to him and said, oh, sure, I can get you $1.1 million for it because I'll market it better. Yeah, it just doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. And I refuse to lie to people. I refuse to lie.
So does a homeowner always need to rehab a property before they list it or before they decide to sell it?
Yeah, not always. I do walkthroughs. The first thing I do is a walkthrough. I'll meet the seller. I'll walk through the property because I can't really have an intelligent conversation about their property until I've seen it, right? Most often, if the property is vacant, right, and there's no furniture in it, it's much harder to sell it, right? It's hard to get perspective. A buyer walks through, they have no perspective on what fits. It feels smaller. It's very, it's just not a warm and fuzzy experience. So when a property is vacant, I always say, the walls and the floors, those are your return on investment. So if you don't have nice floors and you don't have walls and your property is vacant, we're just not going to be able to price it at the top of the market, right? We're going to have to price it according to that. If a property is furnished and if you're living in it, that's when it's probably less important to make any upgrades or improvements to the house before you sell it. But I will say show quality is about 60% of it. So it's got to show its best face. One of the things that I love to do more than anything is stage. I love to stage properties. It's part of my services. I don't hire a stager. I do it myself. I take your furnishings and I give it the best space sort of, set up and use the space wisely and just really give it a fresh face. So it's not always a requirement to rehab the property. And it also, I do a calculation, right? So, if your property is worth X in its current condition, so that's price number one. If we leave it alone and we don't do anything, here's your price. And I've got to work with the average days on market in that community or that neighborhood, and I've got to work with the absorption rates in that. So I go, okay, listen, here's the deal. If we don't do anything, we're going to sell it within the days on market, but here's your price. And then the second price is, well, if we do some small things, like maybe we need to paint some walls, or maybe we need to replace a floor or replace some carpet, that's going to cost, sort of that middle road of X dollars. Well, then we can look at pricing it at this price, and maybe there's a return on investment that makes sense. Or we can then say, well, let's do all of everything. So let's say we put in granite and we replace appliances and we put in new floors and you spend the top end of that. Well, then you can expect this price. And this is your days on market. And so each price category has a different level of risk for the seller. It's probably going to increase or decrease their days on market, which becomes another additional cost. And then it's also going to increase or decrease the buyer pool or the ability to sell it quickly. And so one of the things that I always say to sellers is, listen, how long do you want to be on the market, right? Because that's going to dictate whether you do rehabbing or whether you do the high end or whether you stage. I mean, it's really about how long do you want to be doing this for? And if the average days on market in the community is 90, well, we're in it for 90 days to begin with, right? So let's talk about doing some things because you're going to be there anyways. But if the seller is just like, I don't care how long it takes, I'll be on the market for that 90, plus days, then I say, okay, well, then you're going to have to probably do some of the top end stuff, right? Because your average is 90 right now. So if you want to be on the market longer, then that's fine. We can price it here. So all these factors play into that. There is really it's always a depends for me. It just depends. Depends on the property, the neighborhood, just so many factors. I mean, I've had properties where it was a very difficult floor plan. It was in disrepair. And again, just sitting with the seller and saying, okay, I'm going to be very honest with you. If you don't do anything, you're going to price it here and we're going to sell it. And here's the average days on market. And we're going to sell it within that period. Are you okay with that? And they said, yes, just get me out of it. And we're done. So again, it just depends on so many factors. So they don't always have to rehab, but they always have to give it its best face, right? We've got to do the best we can with what we've got.
So walk me through the process of selling a home.
For selling a home, there's just four main components, I think. Number one, analyzing your reason to sell, right? Really get clear on that. Understand the net, what you're going to walk away with, all of that piece. Then there's the pre-listing period for preparing your property to sell, staging your agent, reviewing your marketing, your pricing, your timing. Then there's the listing period, which is the time that we're marketing and getting buyers through, evaluating the market conditions each week. Then there's getting a contract, and so negotiating all of that and making sure that we're, getting you the best price, the best buyer for the best timing. And then there's the contract to close piece, which is all of the, pulling all the parts and pieces together. And then settlement, going to settlement, giving up your keys and moving on with your life. That's the main components of selling a house. There's a lot of pieces that go with it, but yeah.
So if you're selling a home and buying a home at the same time, is there a certain process that needs to be followed, or how does that work?
So it's the same process for selling your house, but now we have to build in selling your house, finding your house, so the buying process, and not leaving a gap between the two.
So do you use the same agent for both selling and buying the house, or is there a benefit to using it? Because isn't there a seller's agent and a buyer's agent, or can that person be both?
Right. So for me, I specialize in being that agent who lists your house and then helps you get into your new house without having a gap, right? So I'm the sole person orchestrating the entire process between, remember I said there can be 12 parties on one side of a transaction. So now we have 8 to 10 to 12 parties on the selling side. And then we also have 8 to 10 to 12 parties on the buy side. And so I think I mentioned before, I'm very strategic and methodical. So the process is a little different, right? So it's the same parts, right? So we've got the home selling process, same parts as the home buying process, but now we need to integrate them in a way that I am in the middle, orchestrating the timing of listing your house as compared to the timing of buying your house. If you could imagine sort of two, wheels and all the cogs in the wheel, and these two wheels have to come together and fit perfectly together to just move all these parts in a way that there's no hiccups in the journey, right? So on the selling side, first we have to determine whether it makes more sense to list your house first or not. Then on the buyer side, we need to know upfront whether it makes more sense for you to buy first or not. Those decisions are made by looking at the general condition of the marketplace. Remember, I told you all these factors: days on market, absorption, condition, all of these market factors and conditions on the selling side provides us, me and the client, the timing and the strategy for when to list a house. And then the same thing on the buy side. What are you looking for? Is it out there? Does it exist? And where does it exist? So on the buy side, I have to go through a different analysis of the market to help the buyer understand if their property exists within their price range in the location that they want it to be in. And if it doesn't, what are the trade-offs they need to make to find that house? And if the trade-offs are acceptable, then we say, okay, we know that your house is out there with these trade-offs. So now we take both of these pieces and I go, okay, so based on the conditions on the list side and based on the conditions for what you want to buy, what's the timing going to look like for you to list, get a contract, and buy and be under contract? And then and it's a big job, and I love it. It's my favorite transaction because they always go smoothly, because if you can just take in all of these factors of the marketplace and pull them into the decision of how you time it all, because it's all timing, you will have, or I always have, a smooth transaction with that buyer. And a buyer doesn't, they just feel so overwhelmed when they have to sell their house and buy it. And the problem is most buyers think they have to find a house
before they can list their house. And that's not always the case. And then what happens is if they're under this misconception that they have to go and find the house first, what generally happens is this: they spend all this time looking and looking and looking. They find the house, and now they're not prepared to write a contract because their house isn't ready to go on the market. Or vice versa. They think, oh my gosh, I need to sell my house first before I can find something. And they have no idea whether their house exists, where it exists, and whether they're willing to make those trade-offs. So they list it first, and then they get a buyer, and the next thing you know, they have nowhere to go. So all of these factors have to be brought into the equation before we time any of it. And that's why I specialize in that.
I would think that one of the biggest fears that, a client of yours would have is owning two homes at the same time. Can that be avoided?
Correct.
Or how does that work?
That is exactly what I avoid. Nobody wants to have a mortgage, and there's certain structures that we can put into place to avoid that. There's certain contingencies that we can use. There's all kinds of strategy. I mean, a contract can be structured about 100 different ways. So we have to structure each contract to the best of our ability to make sure that the buyer and the seller, this one person, is not either homeless or with two mortgages or has nowhere to go, right? So you avoid it by structuring contract and timing and contingencies to protect the buyer and the seller. In this case, it's the same person, from that happening. Strategic timing is what it is, understanding the timing of it all.
Yeah, because that sounds awful scary. Any one of those scenarios, it sounds scary to me.
You're right. Well, the biggest fear for a buyer is missing something on the market, and the biggest fear for the seller is not getting the most money.
So now we've talked about what it takes to sell the property, how to pick a real estate agent, what are things to look for. Now we're talking about the transition period, but now we're also talking about it's time to talk about buying a home. What are the costs when buying a home? You mentioned a couple of them earlier in the interview, but can you go over that again with me? What are the costs when buying a home?
Yes. So for the buyer, it's mostly your lender fees, the attorney, the title, any pre-closing costs. So for the buy side, the seller has to pay for things out of pocket to get his house ready to sell. The buyer has to pay for things prior to settling to buy the house. The appraisal is an out-of-pocket expense if they do any inspections, home inspections. But the biggest part of the cost for the buyer is the lender fees and their down payment. So the seller and the buyer usually pay around the same amount of closing costs. Buyer's costs are in their down payment and their lender fees, and the selling costs are in the broker fee and some of the title costs. You should think around 2 to 3% for a buyer of your loan amount. That's about what it's going to cost you. That's usually what I estimate them to be.
So how many homes should should a buyer look at before making the decision that this is the house for them?
There is no number, right? So when I work with buyers, I spend a lot of time up front with them talking about, in a consultation, what is it that you want? Remember, I told you I pull searches a whole bunch of different ways for buyers to help them understand what their likely scenario is going to be and then whether they're willing to make some of the trade-offs that they may have to make, so that when we go out the first time, we're looking at houses that are actually viable options for them. So my track record is I have found a perfect home for every buyer that I've worked with the first time we've gone out. Now, that's not to say that they've bought it, and certainly I'm not pressuring anybody. I'm not a salesperson. I'm a consultant, really. So they found the perfect house the first time we've gone out because we spent so much time up front talking through these trade-offs and really getting a good understanding of what it is that they're not willing to trade off, right? But a buyer isn't usually ready to make an offer the first time they go out, even though they found their perfect property, because it's mental, right? They need to feel like they've not missed something. So it can be one house or it could be 100. It just depends on their own preconceived beliefs about, whether they've seen everything that might be available to them or not. And it's my job to really funnel those things down in a way that's very methodical so they feel like they're seeing everything that's going to be available to them, or at least a sample of everything that's going to be available to them.
What are some strengths that you bring to the table when working with this type of client, the type of client that is, selling a home and buying a home and trying to do it, in the same transaction?
Methodical, number one, very methodical, very process-oriented, very strategic, and again, consultative, right? So having open dialogue with my clients and talking through okay, here's strategy number 1, and here's what could happen. Here's strategy number 2, and here's what could happen. Here's strategy number 3, and which one do you feel more comfortable with? And, again, my job, and I think I said it before, is as a realtor is to guide you, my client, through a process. You're making the decisions. I'm not making them for you. I'm just giving you the best information available and my knowledge and my skills to give you an idea of an outcome of any single decision you make throughout this process. And so having this sort of very step-by-step, here's what's next, let's take this one step at a time mindset, that's my mindset, very big picture. And so ultimately I can take these really big, huge, complex sort of challenges and deconstruct them in a way and articulate them in a way that a seller and a buyer can go, okay, I get it. Let's move to the next step, right? Just really bringing it to a very layman's type term. And how are we going to do this in a way that's pain-free and that I've done the best job possible for you?
So if somebody wanted to get in contact with you to either buy or sell a house or for any type of real estate transaction, how would they go about doing that?
Christina at justchristina.com. CHRISTINA at JUSTCHRISTINA.com, or phone text 703-597-3497. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, I love social media. So Christina Macro on all of those social media outlets. I think my screen name is Cape Codder Bunny on those, but you can always look up Christina Macro, but I'm on all the social media outlets as well.
Well, Christina, I really want to thank you for your time today. This was a great interview. I mean, that's the transaction that you specialize in is, there's a lot of moving parts, and I really appreciate you taking the time to explain it all to us and kind of educate us on what's all involved.
Thank you. I really am very grateful for being here, and I thank you so much for inviting me. This has been great, and you've been just terrific to work with, so thank you so much.
No, it was my pleasure, definitely, and I'd love to do it again soon. All right, guys, this is your host, Alicia Dibrell from Insight Media. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.